Hello there. Welcome to CSC324 Advanced Programming. So today what I'm going to do is talk to you about font properties. So we're continuing our discussion of CSS cascading style sheets. Now, one of the fundamental properties of a font is the family to which the font belongs to. So I'll give you an example of a declaration of a font property or font family property in cascading style sheet. You could say font dash family colon Arial, Helvetica, Futura, and sans serif, semicolon. So what this means is that your first choice here is Arial, and if you can't find Arial, Helvetica, or Futura, what I mean by you is if the browser that's rendering your HTML can't find Arial, Helvetica, or Futura, then any sans serif font will do. So any of this type is okay. So it's interesting because Arial is a specific type of font, so is Helvetica, and so is Futura. I mean, those are, you select that and that's the font you get. Sans serif, though, is a class of fonts. So there are a number of fonts that belong to the sans serif family. And so what I want to do is make you aware that of the sort of backstory behind different types of fonts. If you want to use a particular font, that font belongs into a kind of a font family or font category. And so I'm going to show you the different types of fonts. So one is called serif, and anyone who, back in the day when a printing press was being used to create documents, the the people responsible for selecting the characters that went on to the printing press, the blocks of letters that went onto the printing press, knew about these font families pretty well. All right, so now I'm talking about font families not as a CSS thing necessarily. It's more general than just CSS. So serif, the idea behind serif is that it has a fancy finishing strokes. And so it's great for print. But it's bad for display. Because displays just don't have high enough resolution. All right, so I'll give you an example. Here's a basic letter F, right? Now, if I'm going to make this a serif F, I'm going to have some nice finishing strokes at the end of the letter. So I might make this like a little nicer right there. And then as I get down here, I'm going to have some nice finishing strokes down in here too. Okay, nice little curve there. Okay. Glad I'm using a high resolution pen right now because probably wouldn't look too nice if I wasn't doing that. So that's kind of cool. So that's an example of a serif letter F. All right. So sans serif, sans French for not, serif, is not fancy. And this is great for display. All right, so an F, a sans serif F, would look something like this. Okay, nothing fancy there. There's also cursive. This is also fancy. Good for print, not so great for display. So my F might look something like this. F. All right. And there's a fantasy. Fantasy. Whoops. Fantasy. And these are kind of silly. And you can Google the fantasy fonts for these. There's a lot of them. There's okay, so an example might be an example of a type of fantasy font is fairy dust. So Google that. It looks pretty cool. There's little things that are flying off the letters that make them look a little bit like fairy dust. It's quite cool. All right. The last, so this is 1, 2, 3, 4. The last type of font that I want you to know about is the monotype fonts. So monotype. And monotype means that chars occupy the same space. All right, and you'd want to use this for good for code. And it's going to look a little bit like sans serif, except that the reality is that the letter F, the letter A, C, T, if you were to draw boxes around each one of these letters in monotype, you would find that the letters occupy the same amount of space as every other letter. And that's not true for other fonts, non-monotype fonts. With non-monotype fonts, what you find is that different letters occupy different amounts of space. And so you may have tried to do this in the past, like, you know, if you're not using monotype and you have some text, like even if you're just like trying to type code, for example, in Microsoft Word, it's not possible, or it may be impossible, to get the characters from one line of code to line up with characters on another line of code if you're not using monotype font. All right, so now you're aware of the 5 major types of fonts. And for the most part, what you want to make sure that you do is, if you're not using code and you're trying to display text to users, you want to make sure that you're using some kind of sans serif font. Otherwise, users are going to find it really annoying to look at your text. And there's all kinds of web pages out there that don't use sans serif, that might use cursive or fantasy. And it might be cute for a little while, but generally speaking, users find that kind of stuff annoying if they're trying to get at information on your website. All right. So one decision that you have to make when you're working with fonts is to select a font size. So here's another CSS property, font size. And this is kind of interesting. All right, so you're going to put something in here, and then you're going to have a semicolon after it. And you've got basically two ways of specifying font size. So one way is to specify a relative font size. And the two ways to specify relative font sizes are you can specify extra small to extra large, and you can specify percentages like 1% of the default to some number up to 3 digits percent of the default. The other way to specify font size is absolute. And here you've got a whole set of options. You can specify inches, the font in inches, the font in centimeters or millimeters, the font in points, PT, which stands for point. And each point is equal to about 1/72 of an inch. And this weirdness about points and some of the other things I'm about to, and this thing, PC, which is a pica, sorry, PC, which is a pica. And a pica is 12 points, or about 1/6 of an inch. Those specifications come from typography, which is how people thought about and worked with typesetting back before there were computer printers that printed things out. Okay, and then px is in pixels, which are the dots that occupy the individual dots that occupy your screen. So, a worthwhile question is to ask, what are we specifying when we specify font size anyway? I mean, if I specify, 12 points for a monotype, well, let's not use monotype. So 12 points for a sans serif font. What exactly am I saying about the size of the font? Am I saying something about the size of the capital A or lowercase a, or an O versus an L? And some of these fonts, some of these characters in a particular font are going to occupy more space than others. So, what in the printing press days, the font size specified the height of the metal body from which a character rises. So if you think about the way things work in a printing press, if I wanted to say Bob or hello, let's do hello. So if I wanted to print out hello, what I would do is I would pick out these metal blocks. So I'd pick out a metal block that had an H in it, then another metal block that had an E in it, then another metal block that had an L in it, and one that had another one for an L. I better have two metal blocks that have L's, and then O. All right, so I'd assemble those metal blocks together on a board. I'd coat them with ink, and then I'd press a piece of paper up against the metal blocks, and I'd get hello printed out. Pretty nice. So if I knew I wanted to have things appear a certain size, a certain font size, all the letters are going to be organized by or collected by font size. And what we're measuring is this, the height of this box. Let me just draw it here. Here's my H. I'm measuring the height of that block. I'm not measuring the height of the letter H. So that's a very important distinction. It's the block height, not the letter. Okay. Now, in digital days, which I guess is that's what we're in, what we're measuring is the height of an arbitrary bounding box around chars in a font style. So, on average, capital characters are 70% of the height, and lowercase characters are 48% of the height. Okay. Now, this measurement is called the EM. This height that we're talking about is called the EM. Okay, and that's there's a reason why it's called the EM, because there had to be some kind of reference character in the set of characters that you were working with. And in the printing press days, the reference character for a particular font was the letter M, so like capital M. So when you specified the font size, you were specifying the height of the metal box around the letter M. And in the digital world, it's slightly more arbitrary than that. But we can sort of use that as a reference point. So I guess what I'm saying is that we're specifying the height of an arbitrary bounding box around the characters in a particular font family. You might as well use M as the reference character. But of course, like as I've already said, the width of these boxes, or what I should say is that the width of these boxes and the heights of the boxes are going to vary somewhat depending on the character that you're working with, unless you're using a monotype font. Okay, so let's see if we can do some calculations and some interesting stuff with estimates of what things are going to actually look like on the screen of a device, given what we know about font size. So here's the question. What is the height of a 20 pixel capital letter M in inches? All right. So we've specified a font size of 20 pixels. All right. And so what I've said is here's my arbitrary bounding box around the capital letter M. And what I've said is the height here is 20 pixels, the height of the box. Now, I'm interested in actually the actual height of the capital M. So to do this, what are we going to do? Well, the first thing we're going to do is say, the EM of this font, or the font size, is 20 pixels. All right, capital M, is 70% of EM. So it's going to be 14 pixels. But what I need to know is how many pixels. I want to know in inches, like, because pixels are dots on the screen, but different screens have different amounts of dots over a certain physical area, and that has to do with the resolution of the screen. And so what I'm trying to get to, though, is I want to know how big this M is going to be when I view it on my screen. So I want to go from pixels to inches. So in order to do that, what I need to do is I need to get some information about my screen. So let's say I had a screen that was a 30-inch screen. All right, so my screen is 30 inches. So this is a 30-inch display. Let's say that 30-inch display. First of all, who wouldn't want one of those? In fact, I'm recording it right now, this lecture actually, I think, on a 30-inch display. So who wouldn't want a 30-inch display? Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that the display, the diagonal that runs from the upper left-hand corner to the lower right-hand corner, is about 30 inches. To get the exact amount, you need to do a little bit of arithmetic. Not arithmetic, but to get the exact amount, you really have to do a little bit of looking at the specs of the screen. So, and the resolution on the screen is 1600 pixels by 2560 pixels. So that's how many pixels we have in our height versus our width of the screen. So after doing a little bit of research, I find out that this 30-inch diagonal actually works out to 29.7 inches. That's what the specs say. And this height here is 21.3 inches, and the width is 27.2 inches. And that's my Apple 30-inch LED display. So the best case we're talking about 75 dots per inch, or pixels per inch. All right, so I'm going to do a little check here to see how accurate that is. So hang on for a second. Calculator. If I take 1600, okay, wow, this runs so slow when we're doing recording. All right, whoops, let's clear that. So if I take 1600 and I divide it by 21.3, what I get is 75. Yeah, so 75 dots per inch. Okay, so I know, and that means that's the same thing as saying 75 pixels per inch. All right, so if I know that my M is 14 pixels, and I know that 1 inch has 75 pixels, then I'm going to end up with a capital M that is 0.187 187 inches. All right, so that's pretty cool. So basically, what we just covered is the idea of that fonts belong to font families, that there's 5 main types of font families when you're doing HTML programming. And then we talked about different ways of specifying font sizes, and we realized that the font size isn't actually talking about the actual height of a character. It's talking about the bounding box around the character, and that for stuff that we do on the web, the bounding box around a character is actually completely arbitrary. But there's some rules of thumb that we can use, and so we can think about the bounding box as being approximately the bounding box around the character capital M for a particular font. But it's not actually specifying the height of M, it's specifying the height of the bounding box around M. And then we looked at it, went through an exercise of taking a capital letter M and finding out what is if I specify the height in pixels, for example, what is the actual height of the letter M on the screen. And it depends completely on the resolution of the display. So the finer the resolution of the display, the more dots per inch, the smaller the letter is going to be. All right, so there's just a few more things I want to let you know about that you can specify when you're working with fonts as far as properties are concerned. You can specify something called the font variant. And that's going to let you control whether text appears as normal or in small caps. So that would be, small caps would be lots of all capital letters, but some capital letters are bigger than others. The actual capital letters that you want capitalized on words will be large. The other letters, which are normally lowercase, will also be uppercase, but they'll just be smaller letters. You can specify a font size or font style, which is normal or italic. There's also something called oblique there, but it basically looks italic. You can specify a font weight. And there's normal, bold, bolder, lighter, and you can specify a number, numbers 100 to 900, which make things, this is considered normal, and that's considered very, very dark. There's text decorations. So you can specify, the default is none. I'm going to underline the defaults. Default is none, but you can specify underline, overline, line through, and the annoying blink. All right. And finally, there's a font shorthand. Each one of these properties can be specified individually, but you can also specify using a font shorthand. You can say font bold 14 point Times New Roman and Palatino. The order that these are specified in is important. So you want to make sure you're careful with that. So this is in single quotes because there are spaces. And this is the first choice. This is the second choice of a particular type of font. So if you want to find out more about how to do things this way, there's a lot of CSS that you'll see that does specify font information this way. You can just Google it. All right, that takes care of our discussion of fonts.